that excellent presentation by Anna, and looking at environmental impact assessment and the role that has in the types of things that she was talking about. We've had previous speakers covering a lot of the introductory stuff, the environmental impacts, the management context, so I'll be pretty brief on those and focus this talk on the environmental impact assessment process. Is how we go through things like risk assessment, a bit on baseline data, impact assessment, the management and monitoring, some of the things that underpin where Anna was getting to in terms of the uptake of science into actual management. But I'm not going to tell you how to do an EIA. I'm focusing on big picture, not the detail, and with a bit of a science emphasis. But of course, this is all nested in a management context. To set the scene though, deep sea impacts, we had very good talks yesterday from Diva, Jeff and Lisa. So the human activities and the elements of climate change were talked about. We've also just been talking about the openness of the ocean, both in space in terms of thousands of meters of vertical profile, thousands of kilometers of horizontal extent, and timeframes which can operate from seasons, years, decades to millennia. So however you couch those impacts when you start looking at what an operation might affect, those impacts have to be assessed to determine the environmental impacts of that planned operation. And that then gets balanced against the supposed benefits, the economic, societal, technological elements, which are what's driving the interest in exploiting a resource in the first instance. And this is the role of the environmental impact assessment. Now, it's nested, as you will have seen from Anna's talk, in a complex environmental management seascape. You've got your strategic and regional levels. Then you've got a contractor having their own internal company operations, specific project EIAs and EMMPs, and then you've got the input of global, national, or local policies, legal instruments, those sorts of things. So there's a lot going on, but the principles and the process of environmental impact assessment have a broad application, whether they're nested in a complex matrix, as you can see is potentially here, or if they're standalone. So environmental impact assessment, I'll just use the acronym EIA through the talk. It's the process of identifying, predicting, evaluating, and mitigating the biophysical, social, and other relevant effects of development. Importantly, development proposals prior to any major decisions being taken and commitments made. So you've got to get through this EIA process before anything happens. And it's not just a report. And again, two acronyms I'll refer to, which are regarded as interchangeable, but there's the EIA report, which some countries use, or there's the EIS, this is the environmental impact statement, which some countries also use. So the EIS and the EIA report, if I happen to use them interchangeably, are exactly the same thing. But the important thing about impact assessment is it's a process. It's not just the report that you see at the end of it. It's screening. Is an EIA actually needed? There's a scoping phase. What needs to be done to make that EIA a robust and comprehensive one? Then you've got all the baseline data and the stuff that feeds into assessing the impacts of what are the impacts, how severe are they? Importantly, a mitigation stage. What can be reduced or minimized in terms of the impacts that the activity is going to generate? You've got the actual reporting. But importantly, you've also got the management. You've got to know what's going to be monitored, how and when, because that's going to be integral to whether a decision is positive or negative in terms of the risks that are going to be, the risks that are going to be taken by the developer and the management bodies. And along the way, you've got a lot of external input, engagement, feedback loops. So this involves societal input and a lot of stakeholder consultation, as well as just what the operator, the company, might be discussing with the government regulator or the regional body. There are three key components of this process, and I'll just quickly cover these, but I will go through them in a bit more detail. Risk assessment. You've got to start out with identifying the main threats, determining their importance, and knowing what's really critical for getting those biological data that go into the baseline surveys. That then informs the impact assessment, which is now focused hopefully on the main risks, describing and evaluating the impacts of the activity, identifying the mitigation options, what could reduce impacts, and importantly, what remains that can't be dealt to by certain actions. That's then going to inform the management planning. Which mitigation measures are going to be employed? What monitoring plans are going to be put into place? And what management decision points have to be put in place to make those critical sort of rules and regulations that will minimise any harm at the end of the day. So it's not just the EIA report, and it's not just an EMMP. The parts of that EIA process are linked, are integral. I'm going to deal firstly with environmental risk assessment. And I've got a few slides on this because although it's fairly straightforward in terms of what it's supposed to be doing, it's determining the risk to the environment from planned operations and not meeting the management objectives, the stuff that Anna was talking about. It's a well-established process, but it's often taken very lightly. You see very few ERAs right at the outset of an operation. And its role in determining how the impact assessment is structured is key. And it's a tiered approach. There's not just one ERA. It's going to be probably revisited several times through the development of the EIA process. And it's broken into various levels. The first one could be highly qualitative, just getting a group of people together, compiling what data are available. That gives you that first cut at what activities are going to cause impacts, what do you really need to collect the data on to ensure that you understand what those impacts are going to be like and what are their effects on the environmental components. As you go through that data collection process, you can move up level 2, semi-quantitative. That's where you need to be before you can start really talking about an EIA for an exploitation. Ideally, you can get through to level 3, which is fully quantitative ecosystem type models. We do have these for fisheries. Whether we can get there for mining is another story. But the key take-home message here is you need multiple risk assessments as the EIA process progresses. Some of this work has been done for the Southwest Pacific. It's not just an Atlantic or Northern Pacific or Eastern Pacific focus with seabed mining. And a lot of you are familiar with the SPC EU Deep Sea Minerals Project, which took place from sort of 2000 and around 2014, 15, 16, around that period. And one of the things that was done as part of that was a level 1 risk assessment looking at the impacts of potential seabed mining on Pacific fisheries. And this is work done focusing on what the effects of mining for polymetallic nodules, massive sulfides, cobalt-rich crusts, which you can see in the bottom left-hand panel, differ in their distribution amongst the Pacific Island countries and territories on tuna, deepwater snapper, and coastal fisheries. I'm not going to go into this in any detail. The report is online, but it does show you how this risk assessment can be applied with a limited amount of data in the South Pacific context. And what it does, even though it is just a first cut, it indicated when we looked at the likelihood of an activity such as ship presence, for example, what would that have on things like the population size, geographic range, biological parameters of, in this case, deepwater snapper, but also community links looking at sort of food web trophic interactions that Jeff talked about yesterday. And we looked at the likelihood of that threat occurring and then the consequences of it if it did. Ship presence didn't have much of an impact, but when you look at the sediment plume that was stressed in a few talks, both on day 1 and day 2, some of these scores are quite high, higher in fact than seafloor extraction, which is a much more limited operation on the seamounts, which would be exploited for cobalt-rich crust or seafloor massive sulfides. So it gives you an idea of where have you got to put your limited resources if you've got to try and get as much baseline data as possible to understand the impacts and to be able to monitor them. And you can do that across mineral types and grouping the activities into some of the core sort of impact areas that are going to take place in a mining context. Okay, so moving quickly on to how that hopefully is going to structure your baseline and monitoring data. You've got to do this during an exploration phase because you've really got, chances are you won't have enough existing data, and you've got to focus it on the actual activities the operation is going to undertake. Diva talked a fair bit about this yesterday, so I won't repeat any of that. But the complex array of information that you've got to collect is pretty daunting. You've got the physical assessment, you've got to look at the oceanography, you've got to look at the biology, and you've also got to look at other activities which feed into what you need to know when you put everything together to assess the cumulative impacts of either multiple operations or multiple activities. The amount of baseline data required can be really scary or daunting, as I said just before, but there is a lot of advice out there. There's a lot of guidance on the sorts of things you need to evaluate. And a resource that I'll draw your attention to is this orange book, the Regional Scientific Research Guidelines, which were produced for Pacific ACP states as part of the SPC EU Deep Sea Minerals project. That's got advice which is targeted for the Southwest Pacific. And that I think is a good first stop in terms of trying to get a better feel for what might be required and how to do it. But there is a lot, but that particular report and references within it will give you a fair idea of what and why you might need to do something, the gear you could use to collect some of the types of data required, some of the survey design elements, some of the performance categories as to whether your sampling is good enough. So there's a lot of information already out there to help advance the process. But what we're going to come up against time and time again is the practicality. And this is where I stress the risk assessment, because we can't measure everything. We might really want to know everything, understand everything before we start any exploitation. Is that realistic? Probably not, even for really well-developed countries, let alone in the Southwest Pacific, where there's such a huge ocean area and limited resources to undertake the type of work which we might want to do. So we've really got to look at what are the really important things we've got to describe: the drivers, the spatial scale, the time period, how many surveys do we need? What are the key indicators we would want to look at? Can we measure them with enough precision to actually detect change? What is that acceptable level of change, coming back to thresholds which have been mentioned? And can we describe ecosystem structure and function, the sorts of things that Andrew was talking about on the first day? We can quickly put together a very, very long list of what we might like to do, but the concepts can quickly get very complicated, well beyond our data and resources to sample enough, given the limitations of gaining knowledge in the deep sea. So I think the take-home message here is we've got to keep our eyes on the forest and not get lost amongst the trees. But of course, we need those the major trees to understand the forest, and it's a little bit of a catch-22 situation. But we've really got to, I think, try and keep our mind on the bigger picture and really focus our resources and our attention on the things which we can be confident are really going to matter. Very quickly, baseline data is a developing field. It's going to be a combination of standard techniques and methods which have been used for decades, but there is a lot going on at the moment with new technologies and new analysis methods. So advances in genetics, for example, environmental DNA, holographic imaging, those types of things, better resolution of acoustic backscatter to use in an environmental habitat mapping context. There's a lot going on, so it's not a stable field at all. Hopefully, in the next few years, as the need for these data in a shorter time frame become more urgent, in particular driven by seabed mining, we'll be able to utilize this new technology as well as fall back on the tried and true methods. And I will draw your attention to a DOSI working group on this new technologies, which is looking at some pretty exciting stuff. Okay, so moving quickly on to the environmental impact assessment phase itself. What the report has to do, which embodies the EIA, is it describes the environmental baseline, identifies the key impacts, predicts impacts from the full-scale operation, so scaling up from whatever smaller scale work has been done into what the full extraction or exploitation might look like. And it then evaluates and assesses the significance of those impacts and identifies mitigation measures. I'm not going to cover this at all. It would be a course in itself, but I will refer you to some of the EIA report, EIS templates, which have come about. There's one here for the Southwest Pacific, again, coming out of the SPC EU DSM project. There's one for being developed in a very similar way for the ISA, and the same approach has been taken in New Zealand, where we've provided a bit more guidance on what goes into it. But this is this is very much work in progress. There's a lot more detailed work in the backgrounds being driven by the need for International Seabed Authority guidelines, and these are being developed at the moment. So it's a case of watching the space in terms of documentation, which can really help get your head around the practicalities of undertaking an environmental impact assessment. So the third leg of the stool is environmental management and monitoring, the EMMP. The EIS report and the EIA processes to date, the environmental risk assessment and the impact assessment, will identify high uncertainty. There's no avoiding that. High uncertainty in how much we know, how well we know it, and what are the impacts of the operation really going to be. And the key decision is whether that uncertainty is a reason to reject any proposal, or whether a certain level of risk is accepted and safeguards. The precautionary approach is put in place to give early warning signs if things are going wrong. And this is the critical role of the EMMP. It defines the measures put in place to prevent and minimize impacts identified in the EIS, or to restore the environment if that's one of the management objectives. It establishes systems and procedures outlining how the operator is going to do that, how they'll manage the mitigation measures, how they'll measure their effectiveness, what monitoring will take place, what action will take place when something bad happens, and how it's going to report back in a timely fashion to the regulatory bodies and the stakeholders, the public. To do that, it's going to utilize the mitigation hierarchy. So this is an inverted triangle. So it's putting the stress on avoiding or preventing any significant impact. If an operation can avoid that, if the answer is yes, can it avoid a significant impact, then there's no problem. That's unlikely to be the case, either with large-scale commercial fisheries or seabed mining. So the question then turns to what can be done to minimize it, coming down the triangle. You can catch fish in a different place or a time of the year if its spawning is sensitive, for example. You can modify the net design to allow more escapement. With mining, to reduce the plume, you could put a hood over cutting heads, or you could change your operation. You could mine in strips, not continuous. So there are ways where you can practically minimize the impact. But if you've got to a stage where you can't minimize it anymore, what next? And you come down to this rehabilitation of the environment. We do it on land. Can we do it in the deep sea when we're talking about manganese nodules that will take millions of years to accrete? We can't restore the environment, but can we manage it in other ways, or can we rehabilitate some elements of it? Finally, if you can't rehabilitate, or there's only so much you can do, offsets are there as an option, but it's more a land or coastal option where you can either pay an economic fee or you can swap bits of land around. Whether those two things are environmentally feasible or sensible in the deep sea is something that scientists are grappling with, as well as managers. But the residual impact, this last bullet point, is the key question for EMMP. If it can't be managed, then the answer is no, you don't proceed. If there's a significant impact that remains, there'll be no mining or no fishing. But Anna's just talked about spatial management, open and closed areas. That's likely to be one of the initial go-to tools in the toolbox. So you've got like your farmland and national parks, coastal MPAs. You start to protect areas of the environment so that you're compensating for the damage that's going to take place with your extraction. The other element is adaptive management, where if you don't know enough, you just take things quietly, you make sure that as you develop, you've got a structured learning process in place. This is not just to try it and see what happens. This is very much a planned learning process as you start your exploitation with a lot of rules and stop points in place. How have we done so far? There are a number of EIAs that have been undertaken in the deep sea for seabed mining. You can see them there: Papua New Guinea, Namibia, New Zealand, Japan. Some have been approved, as in PNG in Japan, but others have failed. Why? Very quickly: inadequate baseline data, poor definition of impacts, insufficient synthesis and ecosystem approach, not enough attention paid to cumulative impacts, all things that come about through just not knowing enough about the environment before you can try and predict impacts. But importantly, this issue of understanding uncertainty. How confident are we really know what we're describing? And how well do we know what we're going to be able to do about it? And a lot of those problems come back to the importance of the initial risk assessment and good scoping of the EIA. Much less general description, the habit EIAs have of describing everything that can be put down on paper about an area. We've really got to focus on those main impacts so we understand the real impacts of the operation and how to manage it. So quickly in wrapping up, you've seen with previous talks, there's a complex array of impacts across multiple disciplines. A lot of scientific research is required, and there's no shortcut to that. There's a huge commitment that needs to be put into understanding the deep sea environment more. The open ocean, the open nature of it, means that you've got to look at environmental assessments at various spatial and temporal scales, local up to regional, and months up to decades, if not longer. An effective EIA process is based on a strong risk assessment component to focus that research and available resources. Baseline surveys and the importance of them can't be stressed enough, as they are going to be critical to evaluate whether we're having a bad effect or not. But each mineral resource or fisheries resource, each island, each different region is going to have its own set of characteristics. And so we can't just adopt a one-size-fits-all type of approach. There's a very strong link between environmental impact statement and EMMP. They're an integrated package, even though in some regulatory environments they come at separate stages. They've got to be evaluated together before any decision is made. And handling uncertainty is going to be a critical issue given the deep sea environment. And this is where things like spatial management, adaptive management, strong monitoring systems with clearly defined rules and decision points are key. And that's really where we're not there yet in terms of a new development. So there are lots of challenges, but I think there are ways forward, and there's certainly a lot of focus being driven by seabed mining that will mean we can advance in the next few years at least to help handle some of these issues. And with that, I would like to say, Vinaka, thank you very much for your attention.